You know this room, not this exact room, but this feeling. The argument that circles back to the same accusation, though the face across from you has changed 3 times in 10 years. The job that ends the same way, though you swore this company would be different. The relationship that collapses under the same silence, the same withdrawal, the same wound reopening in a slightly different shape. You have stood in this room before. You will tell yourself it is new. It is not new. It is the oldest room in the house of your life, the one you built a door for and locked and never once went back to clean. And here is what almost no one will tell you, though your whole life has been trying to. You are not cursed. You are not unlucky. You are not simply someone who attracts the wrong people or someone who can't catch a break. You are haunted, not by ghosts outside you, but by the one thing you refuse to look at inside you. And what you refuse to look at does not disappear. It does not politely wait in a corner until you are ready. It puts on a mask. It borrows the face of a stranger, a lover, a boss, a mirror, and it walks straight back into your life again and again until you finally turn around and call it by its true name. Tonight, I am not going to give you 5 steps to happiness. I am not going to tell you to think positive, to manifest, to smile through it. I am going to do something much harder and much more honest. I am going to ask you to turn around, because the thing chasing you is not behind you. It has been walking beside you the entire time, in the dark half of your own house, and it has been waiting, patiently, faithfully, almost lovingly, for you to finally open that door. This is a speech about the part of you that you have spent a lifetime avoiding. And it is a speech about why every pattern that repeats in your life, every failed love, every collapsed ambition, every flash of rage you didn't recognize as your own, is not punishment, it is invitation. The unconscious mind does not speak in explanations. It speaks in repetition. It will keep sending you the same lesson, dressed in new clothing, until you finally read the letter instead of burning the envelope. So let us begin where it actually begins. Not with the light you show the world, but with the darkness you were taught so early and so thoroughly to hide. There is an old and simple truth buried underneath centuries of moral instruction of church and school and well-meaning parents. Light and shadow are not enemies, they are twins. They were born in the same moment, from the same womb, and neither one can exist without the other. The moment you turned toward the sun, the moment you decided to be good, to be acceptable, to be loved, you cast something behind you. That something did not evaporate. It did not die. It simply fell out of the light, and it has been growing in the dark ever since, waiting for you to notice that a shadow this long can only be cast by someone standing very much in the sun, somewhere very early, long before you had the words for it. You learned which parts of you were safe to show and which parts made the room go cold. Perhaps anger was dangerous in your house, so you buried it and became the peacemaker, the one who never raises their voice, right up until it erupts sideways at people who did nothing to deserve it. Perhaps need was shameful, so you became fiercely independent, needing no one, right up until you find yourself alone at 40, wondering why closeness always feels like drowning. Perhaps ambition was arrogance in your family's eyes, so you shrank, you played small, you let others take what was yours, right up until a quiet fury started living behind your ribs that you cannot explain to anyone, including yourself. None of that anger, that need, that ambition ever left you. It could not leave you. It is you. What left was your permission to know it was there, and a part of you that is denied permission to exist in the light does not simply stop existing. It goes underground. It puts on a disguise. And from underground, in disguise, it starts running your life far more powerfully than it ever could have. From the surface, in the open, where you could at least see it coming. This is the first and hardest truth. What you do not confront, you will enact. What you refuse to feel, you will act out. What you cannot say out loud, your life will say for you. In the language of repetition, the same fight, the same betrayal, the same collapse over and over until the message finally gets through. Think for a moment of the mask you wear into the world. Not a false thing, exactly, more like the coin you learned to pay with, the version of you that is competent, agreeable, put together kind. It got you through school. It got you the job, the marriage, the friendships. There is nothing wrong with this mask. Every person alive wears one because a society of people showing every raw, unfiltered impulse at all times would not survive its own breakfast table. The mask is not the problem. The problem is what happens to everything the mask does not have room for, because for every polished, presentable, acceptable part of you that steps into the light, there is an equal and opposite part that gets pushed behind you into the dark. Your rage, if you were taught rage was unacceptable. Your grief, if you were taught grief was weakness. Your sexuality, if it was taught to be shameful. Your selfishness, your envy, your laziness, your cruelty, your desire to be seen, your desire to win, your desire to simply rest without earning it. All of it goes somewhere. None of it goes away. It goes into the basement of you and it waits, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. It does not wait passively. It does not sit quietly gathering dust like an old coat in a closet. It grows teeth. It develops its own intelligence, its own hunger, its own agenda, entirely separate from the polished person standing at the front door greeting your guests. And here is where the repetition begins. Because a thing you refuse to know about yourself does not disappear from view. It simply stops appearing as yours. It starts appearing as someone else's. This is one of the oldest and most reliable mechanics of the human mind. What we cannot own in ourselves, we locate in others. The rage you buried in yourself becomes mysteriously the thing you cannot stop seeing in your partner. The neediness you were ashamed of becomes the trait you despise in your friend. The ambition you were taught to shrink becomes the quality you resent in your coworker who dared to ask for the raise you were too afraid to request. You do not see them clearly. You see your own exiled self wearing their face, and you punish it there at a safe distance instead of ever letting it come home. This is why the same person seems to keep finding you over and over in different bodies, different names, different cities. You are not choosing them. You are choosing your shadow's reflection, and it is remarkably good at finding a face to wear. Consider the woman who swears every single time that she will not fall for the emotionally unavailable partner again, and then 18 months later finds herself once again begging for scraps of attention from someone who cannot give her what she needs. She is not stupid. She is not weak. Somewhere in her own history, love arrived attached to withholding, to earning, proving herself worthy of a warmth that was never guaranteed. And until she goes back and grieves that, until she faces the small, wounded, exiled part of her that still believes love must be chaste to be real, she will keep hiring new actors to play the same old role. Consider the man who keeps losing jobs, always for reasons that feel, from the outside, entirely unfair. The boss was threatened by him. The company didn't appreciate his talent. The politics were rigged against him. Perhaps once this was true. But if it is true every single time, across every company, every boss, every industry, then the common variable is not the world, it is him. Somewhere inside him lives an old belief, perhaps, that success is dangerous, that being seen invites attack, that he must sabotage himself before someone else gets the chance to. And so he will keep recreating the exact conditions of his own defeat, dressed up as bad luck, until he is finally willing to sit with the terrified child inside him who learned long ago that shining brightly was not safe. This is what it means to repeat your life instead of living it. The unconscious does not know the difference between a memory and a prophecy. If you do not metabolize the past, you will not remember it. You will reenact it over and over with new characters and the same script until the debt is paid in full. And notice, this is crucial. None of this is a moral failing. This is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. This is simply how a mind works when a part of it has been forbidden from being known. It is not punishing you. It is trying, in the only language it has left, to get your attention. Every failed relationship that rhymes with the last one, every collapsed opportunity that echoes an old defeat, every burst of anger that felt like it came from nowhere, these are not curses. They are messages, urgent, repeated, increasingly loud messages from the part of you that has been locked in the basement for years, banging on the door because it has something it needs you to know. If you have ever paid attention to your dreams, really paid attention, without immediately explaining them away, you may have noticed how often the frightening figure, the monster, the intruder, the thing chasing you down a hallway that never ends, turns out on closer inspection to have your own face or your own voice, or to be doing exactly what you, in waking life, would never permit yourself to do. This is not coincidence. The dream is one of the few honest rooms left in a life otherwise built entirely of performance. It is where the exiled parts of you finally get to speak without a mask, because you, mercifully, are asleep and cannot silence them. Pay attention to what disgusts you in others. Pay unusually close attention to what enrages you far beyond what the situation warrants. Pay attention to the trait you find utterly intolerable in another person, the arrogance, the neediness, the coldness, the selfishness, because reaction that size, reaction that visceral, is rarely only about them. A stranger's flaw should not have the power to ruin your entire evening, unless it is in some way knocking on a door inside you that you have long kept locked. What disturbs you most in others is very often the map to what you have disowned in yourself. This is not comfortable to hear. It was not comfortable for me to understand, and I do not say for me lightly. I mean that every person who has ever done this work, seriously and honestly, has had to sit with the humiliating discovery that the person they most despise, the trait they most loudly condemn, is somewhere alive and unclaimed inside their own chest. This is the price of admission to becoming whole. There is no shortcut around it. There is no way to integrate the shadow without at some point being deeply embarrassed by what you find there. But here is what almost no one tells you about that basement, that shadow, that exiled half of you. It is not only monstrous, it is not only rage and shame and grief and hunger. It is also, in the very same breath, your vitality, your creativity, your appetite for life. The shadow is not simply what is evil in you, it is what is undeveloped in you, what is unlived in you, what is raw and unrefined and full of a strength you were never given permission to use. The same exiled anger that leaks out sideways and damages your relationships is also, if reclaimed, the fuel of your boundaries, your conviction, your ability to finally say no and mean it. The same buried ambition that quietly poisons you with envy toward others is also, if reclaimed, the engine of the life you were actually meant to build. Gold is not found in the light. Gold is found in the dark, underground, where you least expect to look, because you were taught the dark was only ever a place to fear. This is why the goal was never to kill the shadow. You cannot kill it. Every attempt to annihilate a part of yourself only drives it deeper, makes it stronger, more clever, more determined to be seen. The goal is not moral perfection. The goal is not becoming a spotless, sanitized, entirely positive version of yourself with every uncomfortable trait surgically removed. That version of you is not whole. That version of you is only half a person wearing a very convincing costume. And costumes, we have already established, do not hold. They slip, and when they slip, whatever you buried comes roaring out at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, precisely because it was never faced, only hidden. The goal is integration. The goal is to walk down into that basement, not to burn it down, but to turn on the light and finally look at what has been living there, and to say, perhaps for the first time in your life, I see you. I know you are mine. I am not going to pretend anymore that you are someone else's monster. This is not indulgence. Let me be exact about this, because it is the single most common misunderstanding of this entire idea. Facing your shadow does not mean giving it the wheel. It does not mean becoming cruel because you have accepted your anger, or becoming reckless because you have accepted your desire. That is not integration. That is simply trading one form of unconsciousness for another, trading the puppet who denies the shadow for the puppet who is now controlled by it completely. Integration is something far more mature, far more demanding than either extreme. It is holding both. It is standing in the full knowledge of your own capacity for rage, for envy, for cruelty, for hunger, and choosing from that place of complete honesty who you want to be. A person who has never faced their own capacity for darkness cannot make a real choice for the light. They are only performing goodness, the way a man who has never been tested cannot claim to be brave. Real virtue is not the absence of shadow. Real virtue is the shadow, seen clearly and chosen against, again and again, by someone who finally has the full picture. This is the work, and I will not pretend to you that it is easy, or that it happens in a weekend, or that there is a formula that makes it painless. It is not painless. Meeting your own shadow is one of the great humiliations of a human life, because it requires you to stop being the hero of your own story for just long enough to see the ways you have also been the villain, the ways you have hurt the people you claim to love, the ways you have sabotaged the very things you claim to want, the ways your suffering has, at times, been self-authored rather than simply inflicted upon you by an unfair world. This is not said to shame you. It is said because it is the only door that leads anywhere real. Blame is comfortable, and it keeps you exactly where you are. Ownership is unbearable, for about as long as it takes to walk through the door, and on the other side of it is a freedom that blame can never give you, because blame keeps the power outside of you, in the hands of whoever you are blaming, while ownership, however painful, finally puts the power back where it belongs, in your own hands. So how does one actually do this? Not as a slogan, but as a practice, a daily discipline, a way of living that finally stops the wheel of repetition from turning. It begins with a willingness to notice the pattern, not to judge it, not to immediately fix it, simply to notice it, the way a scientist notices data, without flinching, without excuse. The next time you find yourself in the same argument, the same collapse, the same wound reopening, stop before you reach for the familiar story about how this is someone else's fault, and ask yourself a far more dangerous question. Where have I been here before? What does this feel like? What old room does this remind me of? Because the body remembers before the mind is willing to admit it. And the feeling in your chest right now, in this new argument with this new person, is very often an old feeling wearing new clothing. Find the thread, follow it backward. It will take you somewhere. It continues with a willingness to sit with what you find rather than immediately explaining it away. When you notice the trait in someone else that enrages you far beyond reason, resist the urge to simply build your case against them. Instead, quietly, privately ask yourself, is there any way at all, that this lives in me too, not necessarily expressed the same way, but present, in seed form, somewhere I have not looked? You do not have to announce this to anyone. You do not have to confess it publicly. This is a private conversation between you and the parts of yourself you exiled long ago, and it deserves the privacy of a first, tender reunion, not the harsh light of an audience. It continues further still with your dreams, if you are willing to take them seriously rather than dismissing them as static noise from an overworked mind. Keep something by your bed. Write down what you remember, even the fragments, even the parts that feel absurd or embarrassing. Do not rush to interpret them the way a fortune teller interprets tea leaves. Simply notice the recurring characters, the recurring settings, the recurring emotional tone. Your dreams are not random. They are the one place in your life where the exiled self still has a stage, still gets to perform, and if you are patient with them, they will begin to tell you, quite plainly, what your waking life has been too afraid to say. And it requires above all a willingness to grieve. This is the part almost no one talks about, because grief is not glamorous, it does not photograph well, it does not fit into a motivational quote, but every exiled part of you, every buried anger, every silenced need, every abandoned ambition represents a loss, a version of you that was never allowed to live at the time it needed to live. You cannot simply decide to reclaim your anger, your need, your ambition, without first grieving the years you spent without them, the relationships that suffered for their absence, the opportunities that closed because the frightened, exiled part of you was never given a voice at the table. This grief is not weakness. It is the toll paid at the bridge between the life you have been repeating and the life you are finally ready to live. Pay it. Do not skip it. Grief unpaid becomes, once again, repetition. I want to say something now, about the people in your life who seem almost supernaturally to keep bringing out the worst in you. You know who they are, the ones who, within minutes, can make you feel small, or furious, or desperate for their approval in a way that feels wildly disproportionate to who they actually are as people. Do not mistake this for evidence that they are uniquely toxic, uniquely cruel, uniquely wrong for you, though sometimes, certainly, that is also true. Understand instead that these people are often, in the language of the psyche, extraordinarily effective mirrors. They are showing you with unusual clarity exactly where your own unhealed places live. This does not mean you must stay in relationships that harm you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the exiled parts of yourself is to leave. But it does mean that even as you leave, even as you protect yourself, there is a question worth asking in the quiet afterward. What part of me did that person have such easy access to? And how did it get so exposed, so raw, so ready to be triggered? Because that question, asked honestly, will do more for your next relationship than any amount of vetting, any amount of caution, any amount of vigilance about who you let close. You cannot out strategize an unhealed wound. You can only heal it. Let me tell you what this looks like in an ordinary life, because I do not want any of this to remain an abstraction, a pleasant idea you nod along to tonight and forget by morning. Picture a man who has spent 20 years believing himself endlessly patient, endlessly reasonable, the calm one, the one who never loses his temper. He is proud of this. It has become, in fact, the very center of how he sees himself. And then one evening, over something almost embarrassingly small, a dish left in the sink, a comment made at dinner, he finds himself shouting in a voice he does not recognize, frightening the people he loves most. And then, sitting afterward in a silence thick with shame, wondering where that came from. It did not come from nowhere. It came from 20 years of a temper that was never permitted to exist in small, manageable doses, and so it was forced to save itself for eruptions. The patient man was never actually patient. He was simply a man who had exiled his anger so completely that it had no room left to speak except in explosions. Had he allowed himself, years earlier, the small and human right to say, I am frustrated, or that hurt me, or I need this to be different, in ordinary moments, in ordinary tones, the shouting might never have needed to happen at all. The shadow does not ask to run wild. It asks only to be heard before it is forced to shout. Or picture a woman who has spent her whole life being the strong one for her siblings, for her friends, eventually for her own children, the one who holds everyone else together, who never falls apart, who prides herself on needing nothing from anyone. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, she finds herself collapsing under an illness that has no clear medical explanation, an exhaustion that sleep cannot touch, a body that has simply stopped negotiating and started refusing. This, too, is not random. The body keeps an honest ledger even when the mind refuses to. A need denied for 30 years does not vanish. It moves quietly into the tissue, into the nervous system, into a fatigue that finally forces the rest that pride never would have allowed. The shadow does not only speak through anger and repetition. Sometimes it speaks through the body itself, when every other channel has been closed to it. I offer you these two lives not to frighten you, though perhaps a little fear is useful here, a little urgency. I offer them because they are not unusual. They are, in fact, the ordinary shape of what happens to a person who spends decades presenting only half of themselves to the world. This is not the story of extraordinary suffering. It is the story of ordinary avoidance, compounding quietly, year after year, the way interest compounds on an unpaid debt until the bill eventually comes due in a form far more disruptive than the original, small, avoided feeling ever would have been. I want to speak too to the exhaustion many of you carry, the sense that you have been trying so hard for so long to be good, to be enough, to be worthy of love and belonging, and it has never quite landed, never quite settled the ache underneath it all. This exhaustion is not a sign that you are trying wrong. It is a sign that you have been trying to build a whole life out of only half of yourself. You cannot outrun a shadow by running faster into the light. The faster you run, the longer the shadow behind you grows. Wholeness was never going to come from becoming more perfect, more polished, more relentlessly positive. Wholeness comes only from turning around, finally, and inviting the parts of yourself you have been running from back into the house, not to rule it, not to destroy it, to live in it alongside everything else you are. This is the real meaning of a whole life, not a life without flaw, without darkness, without difficulty, but a life in which nothing about you has to live in exile anymore. A life in which your anger has a place at the table, so it no longer has to ambush you at 2 a.m. A life in which your grief has a place at the table, so it no longer has to leak out sideways as irritability toward everyone around you. A life in which your ambition has a place at the table, so it no longer has to curdle into envy toward everyone who dared to want something for themselves. This is not a smaller life than the one you have been living. It is, without question, a larger one, because it finally includes all of you rather than the carefully curated fraction you have been presenting to the world, while the rest of you waited in the dark, growing louder, growing more insistent, growing more determined to be seen. And here is the strange, almost paradoxical gift waiting on the other side of this work. The very thing you have spent your whole life avoiding is the very thing that, once faced, stops running your life from the shadows and starts becoming one of your greatest sources of strength. The rage you feared becomes the conviction that finally lets you set a boundary and hold it. The need you were ashamed of becomes the vulnerability that finally lets someone truly know you, rather than only the mask you performed for them. The ambition you shrank becomes the fire that finally builds the thing you were always capable of building. Nothing you find in that basement, once you have the courage to look at it clearly, needs to be destroyed. It only needed, all along, to be known. I want you to understand something about the timing of all this, because I know part of you is thinking, why now? Why does this matter today? Why not simply continue as I have been? It matters now because every year you do not do this work, the pattern does not weaken, it deepens. The repetition does not soften with age, it calcifies. The argument you keep having becomes the marriage you keep having it in. The self-sabotage you keep enacting becomes the career you never quite built. The exiled anger you keep swallowing becomes the body that eventually, in its own blunt language, tells you what your mind refused to. The unconscious is patient beyond anything you can imagine, but it is not indifferent to time. It will keep sending the same message in increasingly loud and increasingly costly forms for as long as it takes to be heard. The sooner you turn around, the smaller the debt. The longer you wait, the larger the reckoning. So let this be the day you turn around, not with drama, not with a single dramatic breakthrough that fixes everything by tomorrow morning. That is not how this work happens. And anyone who promises you that is selling you a different kind of avoidance. Let it instead be the quiet, undramatic decision to start noticing, to start asking the next time the old pattern rises, where have I been here before? To start sitting for just a few minutes longer than is comfortable with the trait in someone else that enrages you and asking what it might be showing you about yourself. To start writing down your dreams, even the strange ones, even the embarrassing ones, especially the embarrassing ones. To start grieving, honestly, the years spent without the parts of you that were exiled too early by people who did not know any better, in a life that did not yet have room for the whole of who you are. This is not a war against yourself. I want to be very clear about that, because so much of what passes for self-improvement in this world is simply a more sophisticated form of self-attack, a new set of rules for which parts of you are allowed to exist and which must once again be hidden, punished, disciplined into silence. That is not what I am asking of you. I am asking for something gentler and in its own way far more radical, a homecoming, an end to the war, a willingness to open the door to the part of yourself that has been standing outside in the cold for years, banging quietly, then loudly, then desperately, simply asking to be let back in. Because here is the final truth, and it is the one I most want to leave with you tonight. The life you keep repeating is not a punishment. It was never a punishment. It was a message sent by the most loyal part of you, the part that never once stopped trying to get your attention, no matter how many times you turned away. It does not want to destroy you. It never did. It wants to come home. And the moment you finally stop running from it, the moment you turn around, open the door, and say, "Plainly I see you, and you are mine," is the moment the repetition finally, quietly, permanently begins to end. You are not broken. You are not cursed. You are not doomed to keep living the same year of your life, over and over, dressed in new clothing, forever. You are simply like every person who has ever lived, carrying a shadow that has been waiting a very long time to be known. Go and know it. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, because that day will not arrive on its own. Go and know it starting now, in whatever small and honest way you can manage today. Turn around, look behind you. What you find there is not your enemy. It is the missing half of the life you were always meant to live. So tonight, when you leave this room, I am not asking you to be fearless. I am not asking you to have it all figured out by morning. I am asking for something much smaller and much more honest. The next time the old pattern rises, the same argument, the same collapse, the same silence you have felt 100 times before. Pause just for a moment before you reach for the familiar story and ask the only question that has ever actually changed a life like yours. Not who did this to me, not why does this always happen to me, but simply what in me is still waiting to be known. Ask it gently, ask it as many times as it takes, and then, for the first time in a very long time, listen for the answer instead of running from it. That is the whole of the work. That is the whole of the way home.